what's a worker's life worth? To you and me, obviously, it's priceless. But capitalism doesn't see it that way. A worker's life is the cost of doing business and easily disposable when it comes to making profits. And the corporate world has an accomplice in this immoral scam where workers are disposable, and it's called the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And OSHA apparently thinks a worker's life is worth about $3,373 and change. And you'll see what I mean in a moment in my lead segment today. And we also get to hear what life is like in the pandemic from a building service worker in New York City who, like the thousands of people like him, keep a city, not just New York City, but any city, going 24/7 because they can't just run away to their country home or work from home to escape COVID-19. This is Jonathan Tassini, and it's great to have you with us for our show for September 16th, 2020. Our major sponsor is still the American Postal Workers Union that fights for its 200,000 members and retirees, as well as 2,000 private sector workers. You can help this show in two ways. You can go over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel there so we can get the video version of this show distributed and seen by lots more people, because I think that most people aren't going to get the information that we provide anywhere else. And you can become a sponsor of the show in two ways. You can go over to workinglife.org, click on that podcast tab, and then find your way over to Patreon, where you can become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor if you choose, at any level you can afford. Or if you're more comfortable doing that through ActBlue, because you're familiar with ActBlue through the political donations you've made, we've partnered up with ActBlue. So go over to ActBlue, and you can there too become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor of the show. Just a few days ago, it became crystal clear to anyone that had any doubt how little the economic system cares about workers. Now, you and I probably knew that, but now there's a number that we can attach to that as well. The story is simple. Smithfield Foods, which is a massive pork processor making billions of dollars every year, did almost nothing to stop hundreds of workers from getting sick from COVID-19. And in fact, 4 workers died at its Sioux Falls, South Dakota plant. This was all predictable. The union representing many of the workers warned early on that the plants were unsafe, and that's the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. As I've talked about in this show for many months, animal food processing plants, pork, beef, and poultry top any list of the most dangerous places to work, and that's without a pandemic. The speed of the production lines is unbearable for normal human beings, which is why these plants, again on a quote-unquote good day, have sky-high rates on injuries, partly because workers are packed together, they breathe bad air, they're shoulder to shoulder, they're making really quick multiple cuts with very sharp knives on carcasses that are speeding by very, very quickly, and sometimes they actually cut each other accidentally. There is no such thing as social distancing in a pork processing plant because packing workers together is a way of maximizing profit. And what do you think comes first? Worker safety or corporate profits? That, of course, is a rhetorical question. So add in the virus, and what you get is an ideal petri dish for the rapid spread of COVID-19. Now, greedy companies didn't care about these dangers. To try to create safety, and I'm not kidding when I tell you this, some of these companies actually put up saran wrap in between workers to stop the virus from spreading. Saran wrap. So into the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, came OSHA to do an investigation about why hundreds of people were getting sick and 4 workers had died. Now, it's an agency that has very little teeth when it comes to enforcement. Fines have always been a pittance and a cost of doing business. But this story is especially mind-boggling in the midst of a global pandemic. So OSHA does its investigation, it interviews scores of people, and lo and behold, finds a safety violation. Now, that wasn't a language mistake on my part OSHA found a single safety violation, one, for which it's proposing to fine the company $13,494. Yes, for 4 workers dying and more than 1,300 infected workers between March 22nd and June 16th. And those workers, who knows how many they then infected in their communities, not to mention the trauma and the costs that are connected to those infections. All of that, and the company is going to pay a pittance. It's $3,373.50 for each worker killed, or a little over $10 for the more than 1,300 who have been infected, including 43 who had to be hospitalized. Now that fine, that proposed fine, is a green light for every company in the country to do virtually nothing to protect workers from COVID-19, because the message to them is there is no cost, no real cost, no serious cost to letting workers get sick or die. And here's an additional sleazy part of this. Kira Lombardo, a spokeswoman for Smithfield Foods, called the citation, she really said this, quote, wholly without merit. And she told the whole world that the company had taken, quote, extraordinary measures to protect employees from infections. What a sick joke. But hey, people like that get paid lots of money to spew lies and immoral rubbish just to shill for corporations. So let's talk more about this with Jessica Martinez. Jessica was recently on the show talking about the fear workers face when they try to stand up at work and challenge unsafe conditions. You can see that show, as you can see all our shows, in our archive, and do check it out. It was a great conversation. Jessica is the co-director of the National Council for Occupational Safety and Health. That stands for National COSH, a nationwide network that links the efforts of local worker health and safety coalitions and communities across the United States who are advocating for elimination of preventable hazards in the workplace. So I took out my calculator, which of course now everybody's calculator is on a phone. And I did this calculation of what I would say, outrageous fine on the part of OSHA against Smithfield. And I came to the calculation that every worker's death, all the 4 workers who died, from OSHA's standpoint, they are worth $3,358.50. And all the hundreds of workers who were made sick by the virus, over 1,300, as you point out, that's $10 a worker, basically. And I mean, to go to the point about the workers who were killed, to me, that was murderous behavior on the part of the company, because they knew, they were warned, you know all this. But first, tell me what was your reaction when you first saw this number? I mean, you've been around this space for a very long time. Did this surprise you?
You know, at first, I can tell that the information is completely outrageous. It's really upsetting. But the unfortunate truth is that it is consistent with the history of federal OSHA in terms of slapping an employer, and it's a simple slap in the wrist of what worker lives mean to this country. OSHA has been essentially completely silent for 6 months, asleep at the wheel, as the New York Times editorial presented earlier today. And we know that a lot of employers, as they're rushing to reopen in the midst of this pandemic, are scraping and doing what they can to provide some protections for workers. Now, we know that there are very rich industries, very rich employers where profit and production takes priority over anything, and that the reality is that a lot of the most vulnerable worker populations, the industries that are mostly high hazard, such as the meatpacking industry, which has been a heavily impacted industry in the midst of this pandemic, with thousands of workers infected. It's hard to even keep up with the number of fatalities. But we know that in a lot of these recent companies that have been fined a minuscule amount, have had worker deaths. We know, Smithfield in particular in South Dakota had thousands of worker infections, had over 50 hospitalizations, and we know 4 worker deaths. They got fined $13,000. That is nothing for $1 billion industry.
Mm.
And we see this consistently happening, that there is no set standard. There's no enforceable guidelines or enforceable standards for these employers. So they're doing whatever they can, and it's a free for all, essentially, of doing what they claim is some protections for workers. So our position is that, as it always has been, that we're aware that OSHA is a completely undersourced agency, but they are truly doing the minimum in terms of even responding to the over 10,000 of worker complaints that have been submitted to OSHA.
Mm.
And there has been very little citations. Like I said, it's taken them 6 months to just issue these really ridiculously small citations for these employers in this industry itself.
Now, I do want to circle back to the very important point you made, that this is kind of the way OSHA has operated for a very long time. It's easy for many of us who are progressives to say, oh, this is the Trump folks. This is what they don't care. But the truth is that OSHA has been basically a shell of itself and really not functioning very well in workplaces for a very long time because it doesn't get the resources. But, Smithfield specifically, the reason to me their behavior is murderous and their conduct is deserving of not just a slap on the wrist, but jail time for these executives. They were warned about this. You had a union, as you well know, not to mention your important networks, but the United Food and Commercial Workers and the people who actually represent the workers to the at these plants. They've been telling people for months, right after the pandemic started, that the conditions, not just in the pork processing facilities, but in poultry and in beef, were horrendous. And we already know, as you well know, that these processing plants on a good day were dangerous places to work. The air was bad. The speed of the lines is too fast for a normal human being to function. So from my point of view, what Smithfield did, and the reason this fine, this pathetic fine, really shines out, is that Smithfield knew what was going on.
Right. They knew. And the reality is that fining them with such a small amount is really more of an incentive for these
Absolutely.
employers to do whatever they want for workers. They know, oh, is this what it takes? I mean, we're still $1 billion industry. We're still able to pressure workers to work faster, work in these terrible working conditions. I mean, again, the reality of the meatpacking industry is that they're working in confined spaces. They're using very poor quality personal protective equipment. I mean, I've heard stories directly from workers inside these plants who are saying, we are having to use the same mask for over a period of 2 weeks. We've had to do our own cleaning of the mask. If we don't bring our own PPE, we're out of luck. There's these fake sort of precautions that are not really enforceable or that are not really protecting workers. And that's the reality, that true incentive for these workers to work faster and harder in the most unsafe working conditions, imaginable. So.
And I remember some of these pathetic steps that they wanted to take, where they would put saran wrap up in between workers. I remember these kind of crazy ideas. So the point is, they knew actually that this virus was highly contagious when they took these steps. I'm not saying Smithfield specifically did saran wrap. I can't remember which company did. Maybe you remember that. But the fact is that it was well known that those processing plants were petri dishes, essentially, where that virus would spread quite quickly. And so that's what makes their conduct even more outrageous. And not to get too much in the weeds, but what was even more outrageous on the part of OSHA is that if they wanted to, even in their limited framework, they could have actually fined Smithfield for every single violation involving every single worker, rather than just finding one single violation for that $13,000 and change. Am I right about that?
That you are very right about that. There is complete inconsistency in the manner that they are even citing these employers. I mean, just a couple months ago, I think the first fine that was issued related to COVID was at a nursing home in Ohio. There was 7 infections, no fatalities, and they were fined over $40,000. Okay, so we're talking about, I mean, it's still a small amount given the amount of infections, but the point is that there is no real logical consistency of how these employers are being fined. Again, you have thousands of workers infected, in the hundreds hospitalized, worker fatalities, and you slap them in the wrist with a $13,000 fine. It's inconceivable. Now we know that also OSHA, for instance, there's a couple of states, about 20 states across the country, that have their own state plans, in such as the case of California, where you have OSHA. They did the latest fine that they provided in the first around COVID was for a total of $436,000 for Overhill Farms. Again, because they were able to separate each of the citations and not just basically do one citation for the amount of infections and fatalities and the unsafe conditions. So again, it's really speaks so much to the intentions of these citations. Us at National COSH, we have been working hand in hand with a lot of workers in several of these industries, trying to put pressure directly on employers to provide the safe conditions. We know that a lot of workers continue to be retaliated against for speaking up around issues of safety and health. This is where we ask OSHA to step up in their responsibility to protect workers across the country, independent of the language they speak, of their immigration status, because we do know that a lot of these workers in many of these fields in this industry in particular represent some of the most vulnerable worker populations that include workers of color, immigrant workers, and so forth. So independent of that status, of where you come from, the language that you speak, we're asking OSHA to do its due diligence in protecting workers, and that also that they provide enforceable standards, not these recommended guidelines. Because when you have guidelines, the likelihood is that employers that are prioritizing profit and production will not be following proper health and safety standards. So it's really a mess, and we're hoping that, again, that our pressure, our work, our advocacy is empowering workers to make these demands directly with employers, now that we know that the federal agency that's in charge of this is really, not taking a lot of action.
And I wanted to not leave this point about the number of violations alone, because in addition, as you well know, and I want you to explain this, they could have decided to find that what Smithfield did was a willful violation, which is the reason I set the table, pointing out that they knew, that people knew about this, they had been warned about this. And there's a big difference, because if you're found to have willfully violated the law, then that fine could be a lot higher than just your sort of run-of-the-mill violation.
All right, so in terms of willful violations, we do know that, yes, they could have fined even higher with a willful violation. However, even when willful, the amount is not enough. These, again, federal OSHA is operating under some prehistoric standards in terms of their citation system that dates back to the 70s. So again, the agency itself is completely outdated in terms of its standards and citation system. And in addition to that, there's no real clarity as to how these citations are done in the investigation process of what dictates a willful versus serious, which is the case of when in this latest case of Smithfield, it was considered a serious citation under the general duty clause for OSHA, which means there's no clear standard around infectious disease protections. There's no infectious disease standard really at the federal level that protects workers. And again, OSHA is in the position of expediting a temporary emergency infectious disease standard, given the reality of current times, this pandemic itself being considered under an infectious disease. So if they had the will to really make these changes, this would have been expedited and the process would have started months ago.
And the truth is that to look at the big picture, not just in the circumstances under COVID, but to the kind of conversation where we were having about the way OSHA operates generally, even bigger fines in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you're a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company like Smithfield, you're sitting there and thinking, that's not out of my pocket. That's the cost of doing business. What you really have to have, and the only way workers' lives are going to mean something, is these CEOs have to go to jail when these things happen. Because if in the outside world, if you were found to have caused the death of someone, you would be in jail. If not for murder, you'd be there for manslaughter. So what I'm trying to say is that in the outside world, we treat things, the violence against human beings, in a completely different way inside the workplace. It's as if the workplace is this sacred, walled off place where only the CEOs get to decide the behavior, and OSHA obviously lets them get away with it.
Right. No, you are right. I mean, it's very few cases that allow the employer to go through some criminal prosecution process. And in the cases where that's even considered, as we know, we've had some local COSH groups that have pushed for that criminal prosecution of employers. Sometimes you have the supervisor, which is also essentially sometimes, a supervisor in the fields that gets the jail time and never the CEO. So there is inconsistencies in our system. There are inconsistency in the number of inspectors in OSHA in comparison to our worker industries and how many workers we have out there. I mean, I will repeat this, and I've said this in your show in prior times, Jonathan, is that it would take OSHA over 150 years to inspect every workplace. So that in itself speaks to the capacity of OSHA, and let alone now that there's no true willingness to protect workers under under the current federal government, and have them enhance the standards in place or issue a temporary infectious disease standard that would protect workers across the country.
Now, a few weeks ago, you were on the show and you did a fantastic discussion, a fantastic segment and explanation of the fear that workers are confronting out there in the workplace when they try to raise these concerns about COVID-19, about the infections, about the workplace safety situation, that they're not able to essentially be whistleblowers because of the fear that they'll be fired. Doesn't a fine like this essentially suppress that even more and make folks even more afraid now to stand up and raise issues? And so these small fines essentially down the road are guaranteeing that more workers will get sick and die.
Yeah, and that is the unfortunate truth, is that when a worker sees an employer gets this really minimal citation at the expense of worker lives, it only, again, it only amplifies the message that if I even put in a report, complain about working conditions, I am just as disposable as the worker whose life was disregarded. So again, it does create a ripple effect that only impacts workers and any efforts to create safe and healthy working conditions. The workers right now are also really in a really difficult position, given that if they decide to leave their workplace because of the unhealthy and safe conditions, they are also not receiving any economic relief from the government itself. So you're really putting workers in a tough position of deciding, do I stay in my workplace because my livelihood and my family depends on it, or do I walk away without any guarantees of economic relief and so forth? And I mentioned this because us at National COSH have really been battling these two areas where we're asking OSHA to do its due diligence, provide protections, also supporting workers in campaigns where they're pressuring employers to do their due diligence of protections, but also requesting and advocating that governors across the country are providing economic relief across the board for all type of workers when they're left with no job or working part-time, because there is also inconsistency with that, as we know that a lot of immigrant workers do not qualify for our systems in place that provide unemployment benefits, paid sick leave, which is another arena that is very limited in this country for a lot of workers.
And the kicker on this conversation, and I'm curious what you thought about this in case you didn't see it, is a spokesperson for Smithfield was outrageously upset about this particular fine. And rather than say, we kind of made mistakes, we accept the government's $13,494 fine, they're going to appeal it. They're going to protest this minuscule, barely noticeable fine.
Right. And thank you for pointing that out. Another fail in our system is that many of these employers that get these citations have the ability to easily appeal these complaints, and get and have the citation go even lower than, we don't know. And it takes months for that process to happen. But nonetheless, what we hear in the headlines right now is that Smithfield, who has had worker fatalities, has had thousands of workers infected, receives a $13,000 fine. In a couple months, we will not hear from media that says that if that fine gets cut even half of what it is. And it's really devastating. I mean, it's the devastating reality of the inconsistency of worker protections that are being led by our so-called agencies that protect worker health and safety in this country.
And then just to make the obvious point, when those fines get cut, it even more says to workers, your lives don't matter really. Shut up, do your job, don't stand up to the company.
Right. So one important thing is that although we know that the government has lacked in the arena of supporting and protecting workers, we have not given up on this idea that workers, when they take collective action, can demand their rights, and can pressure employers to provide safe and healthy workplaces. We've seen it across the country through different campaigns. We've seen poultry workers who have requested through their petitions, through collective action, whether it's walking out, whether it's a delegation to their direct managers, requesting the proper safety and health equipment. Those collective actions do work, and we do encourage workers that are out there sort of feeling at a loss to talk to their fellow coworkers and see what can we do collectively in creating this demand. Our employer heavily depends on our work. If I walk out of here by myself, there will be no change. But if I work, if we are able to gather workers together to take that action, again, it speaks 1,000 in terms of putting pressure into the employer.
And as you quite well know, because you work closely with unions, that is the value and the importance of having unionized workplaces, because you have a voice and you feel like you're together with the rest of your comrades, and it's not just you standing up alone against the corporation. Well, Jessica, thanks again for really giving incredible insight into this. And we're going to follow this constantly on this program. We want to have you back. Let's keep after Smithfield and these other companies, and obviously after OSHA, to start to really take account of what's happening to workers and bring companies basically, if you will, into the dock, so that they are held accountable. Thanks again, and look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan.
Over the past 6 months, I brought you the stories of frontline workers and the dangers they face in the pandemic. You've heard the stories of poultry workers, teachers, retail workers, subway conductors, and healthcare workers. Now think about building workers, the doormen, the porters, and the janitors who clean the spaces, all of whom are really working 24/7 in major buildings and in apartment buildings in cities all across the nation. Imagine how many people a building worker has to interact with on a given day. People who come and go inside a building. Tens of thousands of workers, 175,000 to be exact, are represented in 11 states and the District of Columbia by Local 32BJ of the Service Employees International Union. To hear some of what those workers are seeing in their workspaces, it's great to have Hipólito Endon, a cleaning and maintenance worker in the famed Rockefeller Plaza in Manhattan. And tell us, to start, Hipólito, where you work and what your job is and how long have you been doing it?
Well, Jonathan, I work at 75 Rockefeller. I'm a foreman at this building. I've been here for 7 years. That's 7 years.
And for those people who are not familiar with New York City, 75 Rock is like Rock Center. It's right in the middle of Midtown between 5th Avenue and 6th Avenue, right?
Correct, yes.
So it's a pretty busy place, right? There's a lot of stuff happening on a normal time.
Oh yes, especially during the holidays. The Christmas tree comes up. Forget about it. It's a tourist attraction in this area. A lot of people. A lot of people.
I know it quite well. So
Yeah.
tell us what your job is as a foreman, and I assume you became a foreman after working as a, if I can say, rank and file member. So now you have to oversee some folks. What's your daily routine like, more or less?
Well, Jonathan, my routine when I come in, I'm the first one in. So normally I got to take care of the sidewalks, make sure they're clean, lobby's clean, the glass, we touch up the glass, make sure everything's top notch, because this building is an executive building, RXR building. So it's, we got to be on our toes with this building. So that's normally my routine. Make sure everything's good. I do my inspections. I got my crew. They're coming around 8 a.m. And, I assign them each their routine every day. Make sure the bathrooms are clean, tennis floors are nice and clean. Make sure everything's running smooth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And of course, in a building like that, there's a lot of contact with people. There's a lot of movement, again, on a normal day. So when the pandemic started, what was your first concern, both for yourself and for the people you work with?
Well, our concern was that, this pandemic was like, it was going crazy. We didn't know what to expect, to be honest. We were kind of scared ourselves, to be honest with you, Jonathan. We were required to wear gloves, our masks. They had disinfecting every day, every time. We just kept going around throughout the building, disinfecting the handles of the doors, especially the restrooms. A lot of people go into the restroom, stuff like that. So it did change our lives, to be honest with you.
And in the beginning, before it became a common thing for everybody to wear masks, did the employer give you enough personal protection equipment right off the bat, or did you have to fight for that and demand that it be there all the time?
No, Jonathan. Thank God, our building, they just provide us with PPE. So we never had an issue with that. Mm-hmm. Every time we requested anything we needed, we got it.
So then I guess the other concern would have been interacting with people who are coming in and out of the building, right? Because in the beginning, not everybody was wearing masks. Not everybody took it seriously. And when I say in the beginning, I mean sort of March, April, before people understood how quickly the virus could pass and move around.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, like you said, not a lot of people, they thought it was just, people were trying, they didn't want to get into panic mode, I guess, Mm-hmm. Some people were concerned, okay, why is that person wearing a mask? Is that person sick? A lot of questions were asked.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And the other thing that it occurred to me that when the pandemic started, there was very little attention paid to the cleanliness around you, to the notion that you had to be 6 feet apart. That only started. So were you able to demand that your work allow people to maintain social distancing?
Yes. Well, like you said, they started giving us instructions. Elevators weren't crowded. Sometimes only 2 people would go into the elevator. People kept the distance, and again, they started wearing masks. You saw as the pandemic started growing, people started wearing the masks, the gloves, and stuff like that, and kept the distance. So that's as the pandemic started getting worse and worse.
And you were thinking along the same lines as me. In a big building like that, the first thing I think is I wouldn't want to get on an elevator with a bunch of people. So did you have to manage that, or you or your coworkers? Were you assigned to manage how many people could get into an elevator at once? Is that your job?
No.
Okay.
Actually, management, they're the one who provided the instructions. Us porters, like when we got to certain floors, we use the spray elevators. So those spray elevators weren't that crowded. So, we were able to maintain our distance in the elevators. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, at the same time, I assume that there were potentially some layoffs of folks that you knew, either working the building or colleagues of yours?
No, thank
Oh,
God, Jonathan. No, none of us got laid off. What they did to us, they had us alternating.
hmm.
Like half of the crew will work 1 week, the other the other half of the crew will be off, and then vice versa. We kept alternating.
So your hours were reduced?
No, 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 no,
No.
no. None of our hours were reduced. When we got the week off, we got paid, so we didn't lose no salary neither. So we
Eh,
really appreciate that too. How
Well, and
building.
let's make it clear, this wasn't necessarily because the employer was so generous. It's because you have a union standing behind you demanding certain conditions. So this is
Correct.
a great example of why it matters in a place that has a union that can defend its workers, as opposed to so many workplaces. I'm thinking of Amazon, for example,
Right.
where workers don't have a union, and basically the boss, the CEO, the company just basically treats the workers as disposable commodities who can get
Right.
sick or die.
Well, that's true. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I know a lot of friends that got laid off, like you said, laid off and no union, nothing like that, you know. And
Hmm.
it kind of, it was. I mean, I felt bad for them, to be honest.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Now, I guess I have to ask the question. It's a hard one. Did you have coworkers who got sick or, God forbid, passed away, or is everybody healthy?
Um, Jonathan, thank God, none of my coworkers got sick. Thank God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing, I mean, I could be honest, we lost. I mean, I lost for our family
Oh,
due to this pandemic. Yes.
who was that?
So
Who did
I
you?
lost three uncles of mine.
Hmm. And
Yes, but they were. I mean, one had cancer. The other one was just recuperating for a brain stroke. And then my other uncle, he got sick. He didn't want to. He don't believe in doctors. He didn't bother going. So he just thought that home remedy medicine was going to help him out. But I lost three uncles, so it was kind of
so
hard.
at least two out of the three of them had pre-existing conditions. They already had
Correct.
some illnesses that made them vulnerable.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
So I know that you are an activist within 32BJ. You know lots of folks in other buildings, not just in the commercial buildings, but obviously in the apartment buildings where you've got folks who are the janitors, who are the doormen. Tell me a little bit about what's happening to them from your point of view. How are they coping with the virus right now?
Well, like you said, I got family members that in 32BJ also. They work in residential areas, and they tell me the same thing. They got PPE. They also disinfecting constantly the revolving doors. Uh, maintain the tenant floors clean, the residential floors clean. Um, my brother actually is a residential supporter, and he tells me some people like really, really are like, uh, uh, can you step back when they're passing by or whatever? They like very, very scared, you know. Even
Mm-hmm.
though the porters are protected, they're going through this too. Like, they feel bad because they tell them move back. I'm passing by. So it's kind of hard to be honest with you. We trying to maintain, and some people just, I don't know, they just don't want to get us. Us porters too close to them, which we're not.
Mm.
But they tell me the same thing. They see this type of stuff.
And back in your community, when you leave work, obviously there's a lot of folks that you know in 32BJ who are also probably your friends outside of work. You pointed out your family members. What's happening in the community that you live in terms of the workers and how they're being supported, especially now that this extra unemployment, the pandemic unemployment insurance has expired? I guess from the perspective of a union activist, you see a lot of people now struggling, right?
Yes, a lot of people, and to be honest with you, Jonathan, some people they don't, they're working legally. I know
Mm.
a lot of people in my community, they're family, friends, and they're not able to collect any unemployment insurance at all.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going through rough times right now, and which it's really bad. So they got kids and everything, that's the thing. That's the worst part when you have a family and it's hard to provide for them, knowing that you don't have you're not a citizen or legal to be working in the States.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's kind of rough.
And that money recently ran out for people even who were legal immigrants, and in other words, they were able to get that unemployment insurance, that extra unemployment insurance. They were able to sign up for it. But the real crazy thing about this is they're working within the community. They're going to their work, and just because they don't have this piece of paper, and now I'm talking about the undocumented folks, they can't get that extra money that helps them make ends meet. And is the union able to help folks like that access that kind of money, or basically are they being shut out now from that?
Well, the only thing I could say, Jonathan, that the community is helping out, by the local churches, they give like food, food, like bags of food for the people that really need it. I mean, they go and they give it to anybody basically. So, I mean, that's how much I see the community is doing, giving food to the people that, in order to survive out here,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I don't see like any money issue. I mean, money wise, I don't see anything like that in my community, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, just to circle back about one more thing that occurred to me within your building and your work. Next to your buildings, are there non-union buildings as well, where folks who are working under worse conditions?
Well, Jonathan, since Rockefeller's all buildings, all unions.
Yeah.
No, not really. I mean, the only thing I could tell you is like a hotel, 2 doors down, that they're cleaners too in a hotel, and they're non-union.
Yeah.
And they, I speak to them, and they tell me they're only working 2-3 days a week. I don't know if they collect unemployment, to be honest with you, but they're non-union.
And I assume also because they're not union, they don't have the personal protection equipment as much as possible when they're working, because they either have to pay for it out of their own pocket. The employer might be pretty slow about getting it to them, again, because the places where workers have been the safest, and it's still been dangerous for folks, if you think about the poultry industry, transit, the people that have been safest are the people who have unions.
Yeah, you could say that, yes. You could say that.
Well, because they have a voice standing up for them, right? And so I'm sure you're seeing the difference as a 32BJ member. You can make that comparison and see how much more protection and a voice you have, and the ability to say to the employer, hey, over here it's dangerous, we can't work under these conditions, which forces them in the best circumstances to respond, right? I mean, in a non-union situation, I've been doing these segments since the pandemic started. In non-union places, this is where workers are dying and really suffering the most. And I gave the example of Amazon before. That is the greatest example I can think of. You've got the richest guy on the planet who basically treats his workers like disposable items.
Right, yes. I read about that in the news. It's very sad, to be honest with you. It's very sad. I think he just cares about his money. That's all he cares about.
But at least among your folks, among workers who are under the 32BJ roof, you've been able to actually stand up for folks and make sure you have safe conditions to work during the pandemic.
Yes, I know that the union's been doing like rallies and stuff like that, to get, fighting to get more PPE, where the union's trying to help us get hazard pay, which I don't think we're going to get anything like that, It's just, it would be a great help, because we're risking our lives out here every day, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Going back and forth.
Yeah, talk a little bit of another minute or so about this hazard pay. What are you trying to do in terms of getting hazard pay, and what's the status of that right now?
Well, I think the House had passed for us to get the hazard pay, but Trump said no, that he's not going to sign that, and I mean, we feel that he's not looking out for us, because, like, again, we're risking our lives, maintain these buildings to be nice and clean, disinfecting all the time. We're risking ourselves coming in the train and transit, and then going home back to our families. God forbid one of us go home, with this virus, and then you get your family sick. It's a big risk. Jonathan, it's a big risk.
And people have to take that risk because they can't afford to stay home, even when they're ill, because we don't have paid sick leave in this country. So people have no choice, especially, I'm sure, people
Right. That's true. We have no choice. I mean, unless we get laid, we're going to get laid off. then like you said, we get unemployment and the extra $600, but we never got laid off. I
Right,
think as
and-
porters, we always got to be maintaining the building clean and always disinfecting.
And so because everybody needs a paycheck, there's tremendous pressure on people. Let's say you wake up and you're not feeling that great. There's a tremendous pressure to still go into work and work while you're sick sometimes.
Yeah, you could say that, but thanks to 32BJ, we got sick days, we could use, and that covers us. I mean, it covers us, and we're good, thanks to the union,
Another example of why it's so important to have a union, because in a country where you don't have paid sick leave as a national policy, it's really through a union contract that you get it. So one last question again on that. What would the hazard pay do? What would it give you? Would it give you extra payment on top of what you get because of the situation you're in?
Yes. As far as I read, I think they give you $13.50 extra an hour, starting from January 27 to the present. That's what I read. So, but with Trump, I don't think we're going to get this.
All right, Hippolito, thank you very much for your time, and please stay safe out there. And as this develops, happy to have you back on the show if there's any development, but stay safe, and thanks for being on the program.
Thank you, Jonathan. Nice to meet you, and stay safe likewise.
That'll do it for this week's show. Thanks to my guests, Jessica Martinez and Hippolito Andon. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Our major sponsor is the American Postal Workers Union. You can help us in two ways. You can go over and subscribe to the show on YouTube so we can spread the video portion of the show as far and wide as possible and build the show on YouTube and get the information that we have here to as many people as possible. You can also become a sponsor of the show. You can do that in two ways. You can go over to workinglife.org, click on the podcast tab, and then find your way over to Patreon, where you can sign up to be a sponsor of the show, either on a one-time basis or on a regular monthly basis. Or you can go over to ActBlue, because we've partnered up with ActBlue, and you can become a sponsor of the show through ActBlue, again, either as a one-time sponsor or as a monthly sponsor. Thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.